So one of the key issues when you're doing a platforming game is this whole notion of the player being able to jump, right? One of these things where the player can consider jump, maybe the player can climb, maybe the player can, say, hold on to the ceiling here. But there's this general idea of, that the movement has some two-dimensional but up and down, left and right sort of capability to it. Extreme cases where you can do all kinds of crazy things. This version here, I'm sort of emulating a little bit of the classic Sonic the Hedgehog kind of thing with our friend Knuckles here. But the key thing I wanted to talk about was this whole notion of groundedness, grounding the player. And allowing the player only to do certain things when they are in contact with, say, the ground, or in contact with the wall, or maybe in contact with the ceiling. And there's potentially a lot of different ways to handle it, right? So there's a bunch of things we can do. Now, our little hero here, I've set him up actually a bunch of different ways. Now, you should all be familiar with sort of the classic colliders now, right? So I could have a bunch of colliders on our little hero character here. For example, I could have, let's see, turn some gizmos on here, right? So I could have a set of box colliders, and you're going to see some extra, there's a couple of extra bits here, but you see the green arrows, the green boxes on the sides and the green box on the top and the bottom. Those are all box colliders, and they're set up as triggers at the moment. So they don't have any real physics interaction, but they can detect when there's a collision with the top, the bottom, the left, or the right. And I've actually set them up so that, there's top, I think it's top, or is that bottom? Well, that's the key there, right? That's the challenge. Let's turn this one on and off. Okay, that one is the bottom, and the next one is the top, and then there's the right, and then there's the left. So depending on which one collides, I could kind of figure out what's what. Now, it's a little bit tricky to figure out which one collides because they're all on the same object here. That's a bit of a challenge. So let's leave that off the table for the moment there. All right, so that notion of the gizmos there. So let's imagine what other things could we do? Well, there is this notion of, well, what I really want to do, let's see, let me pull up a pen here. And the idea is basically you want to be able to detect are the feet of the character or the feet of the player colliding with the ground, or is the head of the character colliding with the ceiling, or with, is there a wall to either side, something like that. So you're looking for different collisions. So we have set up, potentially here's a collider on that side, here's a collider on this side, here's a collider, right? So you could set it up with colliders, and colliders are cool and all, but the challenge of colliders, I suppose, is that they are positional, right? So if this were to rotate, for example, like if our player was to roll, the colliders would sort of roll with it. And that might be kind of odd. And it's kind of weird to set up all these multiple colliders and whatnot and so on. So let's think about, what could we do potentially with this? Just, okay, start off with down, right, for example. Now, we have a number of different what we call casting features in Unity, right? Casting. And what casting allows us to do is we put a object into the scene, or we cast something into the scene. It could be a circle, it could be a ray, it could be a line, any number of different things. And we're going to detect collisions with that thing that we're casting into the scene, right? So we could do a line cast or a ray cast, or we could also, this notion of, we could say overlap, right? That's another thing we've done. We've done overlapping circles And you could also do other areas and so on. But overlap is another thing. And these are both supported by basically the 2D physics system. Right? So we have this casting and overlapping that we can use. So basically what I want to do is say, well, if I were to, say, cast a line from the center, from the belly button of our character here, and I cast this line in this direction with a certain distance, what do I hit, right? And I don't want to hit the player, right, because that's going to be a problem, but I want to see, does it hit something called the ground, right? So if it hits the ground, which is a collider that's on a certain layer, let's see over here, if I look, you'll see I have a tile map down here. And if I go, I'll show you the tile map collider. Well, we can just see it there, I suppose. All right, there's a tile map collider, and that is the ground, right? Pardon my movement here, right? This is the ground, this collider here, right? And if we scroll up here, you'll see it is on a layer called ground, right? So I want to look for collisions of this ray with the ground. Or what else could I do? I could say, well, yes, that's the challenge with Unity. There's always a million ways to do it, right? Or a dozen ways to do it. You could just say, well, here's a circle. Throw that into the scene and do an overlap circle. And sure enough, the circle is going to overlap the ground right there, right? So an overlap is a way to do it, right? I could say, okay, line from the belly button down and do a raycast. That would do it. I can also do things like even cast the collider of the object itself down into that. And that's yet another way to do it, right? So there's lots and lots of different ways. Are any of them the wrong way? I don't know. That's the challenge. The problem is, each one, it's going to depend on your game, what you really want to do. You know, how well does it work? So, you know, there's going to be, the implementation is going to change quite a bit. I've got some different things here. So imagine in my game, I have my hero. And my hero, I've got a couple of things going on. I basically have a basic input. I get a left and right, or a horizontal and vertical axis. And I can potentially also have a button that's jumping. Right, and I won't get real specific into my what's called my fizz mover, like how I'm going to move the character based on those inputs, because that's going to also depend on your game, right? Is it an object that can rotate? Is it an object that slides back and forth? Are you just doing it according to physics? Are you doing it according to, you know, changing the velocity? That can all change as well. The part I really want to concern ourselves is with the potential, you know, how do you figure out, are we climbing? Are we grounded? Are we overhead? Right. So for those things, I have a couple of different bools, right? I have one that's my jump. I should maybe keep the jump part a little distinct from here. So let's put the jump up here. All right, but the grounded, climbing, overhead, right? So climbing really means potentially climbing, climbable, climb ready, you know, or is it something overhead, right? So in this fixed update, I am actually doing the things according to that. I'm setting the climbing, the grounded, and the overhead to certain animations, right? Because I might have certain animation states. And I'm also telling my animator about the horizontal and vertical velocity so my animator can do the right thing. So there's not really a lot of interesting going on here. But you'll see in between here, or before calling, you know, setting climbing, grounded, and so on, I have a couple of, well, two different functions. One called get contacts and the other called Raycast Contacts, just to show that there's a couple of different ways to do it. Now, the first one I'm doing, or the one I'm doing right now, is this Raycast Contacts. And so let's look at what Raycast Contacts looks like. This is probably the most straightforward one, which is the one why I like to talk about it first. And this is the one where we just draw a line, right? And we just draw a line from the center, from the transform.position, the center of our player object, and we draw it in a number of different directions, or, you know, we check in each direction. So I could say grounded is when I draw the line in the downward direction. Notice I'm using vector2.down, which is just the world space down. So it doesn't matter if I'm rotated or not, right? Vector2.down. The length or the distance is 1, so it goes, just that turns out to be a reasonable amount. And I check, using my layer mask, am I hitting either the ground, anything layered on the ground layer, or anything on the walls layer? And so that's fair enough. You can do one or the other. I have similar one for checking if something is overhead. I cast a ray, and I use vector2.up. Right, so it points up, and also length of 1. And then for climbing, I actually do 2 things. I cast 2 rays, one in the right direction and one in the left direction. I could have a climbing right, a climbing left, depending on what I need in my game, and just do the right thing based on that. Right. So there's it using raycasting in here. So if I wanted to say use physics 2D raycast, right? Now, another possibility is I could, let's see, I don't think, do I have one here that's the circles? I don't think I even did a circle overlap one. Oh, no, I did. Okay, here's get contacts. Let's look at get contacts. We have a couple of different options in here as well, right? So, say I wanted to look for overlapping circles. I could say grounded equals physics2.overlap circle and say, okay, draw a circle at the belly button of the player with a radius of 1, looking for it to hit anything on the ground layer, perhaps. I could check to see if it's climbing, if I'm hitting anything on the walls layer, right? Same idea, I'm just drawing that circle. Now the challenge is, when I have a circle that's just centered at the belly button of the player, it's tough to say which is overhead or which is grounded, which one's overhead or below, right? Because that's sort of one challenging bit of it here. All right, so that's one. Now, I could do something where I had colliders for the bottom versus colliders for the top. That's another thing. All right. Now, I'll leave that up to you to figure out. Do you want to have something that can detect overhead or not? Do you cast a separate circle? Do you move the circle? Now, notice I could say, well, here, this one is at the belly button, and it's 1. You could have one that's at the head with a radius of 1, one that's at the feet with a radius of 1. Right? It's all how fancy you want to get. So second up here, another way you can do it, you could use the actual collider itself, right? So I could check, okay, the collider that we have here, our basic collider, is it touching any layers? And if so, what layers is it touching? Is it touching the ground? And if it is touching the ground, okay, then we're grounded. Okay, also check, is it touching any layers called walls? And if it is, all right, we can climb. Right? This one is also a little bit potentially finicky, because how would you say grounded if it's doing both of those things, or it's touching the ceiling and so on, right? So this is a little bit finicky, right? But you can always just say, all right, poll check, is it touching a certain layer, right? So if it is touching, we have overlap circles. Then you can also even do things like casting of the collider, right? So instead of casting a circle or casting a ray or casting a line, I can actually cast the collider that's this object is using. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm actually casting the collider in the up direction, or actually in this case, sorry, I'm checking grounded, so I'm checking it down. I could have used vector2.down. So that's one. I cast it in the downward direction. And then I cast it in the upward direction. You'll see vector up, right? Negative is down, positive is up. And then I also check left and right by negative right and just right. Right? So it's another way. Now, I wouldn't do all these at the same time. It's just pick one, right? Do you want to use a cast of your collider? Do you want to use, look at your collider and see, is it touching other layers? Do you want to draw an overlapping circle? Right? Lots of options. Do you want to just do a raycast? Now, you can also, if you set up your colliders, you could potentially say, well, why don't I just look at the collider, right? If I can check my collider to see it's touching, just go ahead and use my collider and say on collision, enter on collision, and so on, right? Could I do that? turns out you can do that as well. So I have an example of that down here. So imagine we have on collision enter 2D. Now this one is a little bit challenging as well, because the problem here is that if I have a number of colliders, and say I have our tile map, again, let's go over here, let's zoom out and see our tile map here. There's a lot of different kind of things about our tile map that's a little bit unusual. Like, what if our tile map here goes from here to here, right? Or there's a tile map that goes from here to here. So what if I had this situation, here and here, right? If I have the same tile map collider on here, right, and the character were moving in this direction, the moment they hit here, it would still be colliding, right? So it only reports a new collision when I've stopped colliding with it and then have a new collision. So it's a little bit tricky if you're moving around an environment and relying potentially on colliders to move you around. Now, for that scenario, there is one thing we can do to kind of help with that. And that is, we can, instead of just using on collision enter, we might use on collision stay, right? Which is what I'm doing in here. You'll notice I have on collision stay 2D. So that means as long as I am continuing to touch that thing, then check, right? So I can check if I am touching any collider, I'm staying inside the collider, haven't left the collider, right? I'm going to actually check my contacts. And this one's a little bit even fancier because I'm checking my contact points, right? The physics engine can get very fancy. So just introducing lots of ways to do this. You might have to drill down in any particular one, do a little bit more research, look for, get contacts versus is touching layers versus is touching versus, and so on and so on. So in this case, I have it set up so the moment I contact something, it's as if I was also staying inside of here, right? So I'd be checking to see, am I touching something that's above me? Am I touching something that is below me? Am I touching something that is next to me? Right? That's what this math is doing here, right? It's checking the actual contact points to see where am I in contact with things. So this can all be done with a single collider. That's what's kind of cool about this one, right? But I also have to keep track because it's not telling me when I'm no longer touching them. So I have to also use on collision exit 2D in order to say, okay, I've stopped touching something, therefore I should no longer have, right? If I can only jump when I'm touching the ground, I have to make sure that I disable jumping when I'm no longer touching the ground. So I might have to turn off overhead and climbing. This version here is a little bit wacky because, again, it gets a little bit complicated. If you want to say, well, I want to be able to move as soon as I touch the ground, and I have a bouncy physics material, right? You may wind up, you can only move that very instant you hit the ground and you bounce up again, right? So it's a little bit challenging. So what did I do here? I said, well, okay, as long as you've touched the ground or touched the wall within the last 0.3 seconds, I let you move left, right, up, down, right? So you get into scenarios like that. Movement can be tricky, can be subtle, depending on how advanced you want to get, right? And one of my goals with this one is to make it as physics-based as possible, right? So I'm kind of fine-tuning lots of things on the fly here. So let's see, the one other scenario, all right, what about using triggers? Now, triggers work pretty well also, right? Where are we here? On trigger enter and on trigger exit. All right, so the moment I enter the trigger, now this one is when the trigger is actually touching the trigger of the player, right? So the good thing is it will enter and exit the sides versus the top versus the foot, right? There's actually multiple colliders on the player, right? This one's, again, a little bit more advanced. On trigger enter 2D, and it checks, basically. It checks each collider on the player object here. You'll see actually called and I've asked, okay, get me all of the colliders that belong to this player, and then start checking. I know that the first collider, which is actually the second, there's a 0th collider, then there's the first collider, and I check, is that touching any layers? I then check the second, or in this case, third collider, is it touching any layers? Right? That's the one that's above its head. So I said if the above head one touches any layers, overhead is true. And finally, I check the last 2 colliders to see, are they touching anything? And if so, that means it's touching one of the walls. So there's lots and lots of ways to do this. Like I said, sometimes probably the simplest way is to start off with something like the typical raycast and check. Right? The raycast, you just want to draw rays out from the position of your player, from the belly button of your player, down, up, right, left, and then do the right thing accordingly. Right? That's one of the simpler ways to do it. But even that, you might get fancy. Right? So let's talk about that again for a second. Now you'll notice my little gizmo here, which is kind of a little weird looking gizmo. I kind of want to draw it out. The idea, just to further whet your appetite for doing this in crazy, confusing ways. Now, what I demonstrated there was the notion, okay, belly button, cast a ray down, cast a ray this way, cast a ray that way, right? So the up one tells us overhead. This one tells us ground. This one tells us, well, climbable, either one of these, right? This one or this one are the climbable ones. All right. So, what are these little lines over here about? Well, in some of the more advanced systems, you might do something where you've probably seen it in a game where, say, Knuckles or Sonic or whatever your character gets close to an edge of something and then teeters over the edge, right? As if it knows it's close to the edge of something, right? Or it hangs off of something, or it kind of climbs back up, right? So it has this notion of sort of being like on the corner of something, or on the edge of something. So in that case, you have to do an even more advanced version where you might say, okay, cast this down, see, are they both hitting the ground? Right? If one's hitting the ground and the other one isn't, guess what? You might be on an edge. Right? So draw your teetering animation. Right? And you know this is the void, right? So you can have them going, whoa, over here. Right? One option. And also, there's scenarios where imagine you have him climbing up the wall and he gets to, say, a corner like this and you want him to climb up. You want him to come up and over, right? So you say, okay, is this one hitting? Okay. This one isn't, right? It doesn't collide. So therefore you say, all right, he should do this up and over thing, as opposed to if both of them were hitting a wall, right? If both of them hit the wall there, you'd say, all right, just stick to the wall. Right? So colliders, collisions, raycasting, how you do things in a 2D platformer, all depends how fancy you want to be, right? If you just want to stay on the ground and just determine, okay, am I on the ground? Am I allowed to jump? This starts off with the simplest case. Am I on the ground? Am I allowed to jump? And in that case, all you need to do is something simple, is to say like, okay, maybe we just do a raycast from the belly button to the floor. You say, did we collide with that? And allow you to jump if we are. Or even do an overlap circle, right, with that. All right, so that's my discussion of some of all the crazy ways to handle the grounding condition and things you might want to do, considering if you want to get advanced or not, to have, again, teetering over an edge or climbing up over an edge, or, coming around a corner or things like that. How you can get fancy with that using any number of different ways. All right, think about that one for a while. Take care. Bye.